Hi, my name's Paul Thomas, and this webinar is entitled Seasonal Variations in Cheesemaking. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first of all. I work as a freelance dairy technologist, food safety consultant and cheesemaking instructor. I work in the UK, across the rest of Europe and around the rest of the world. I started out my career in cheese with a degree in biochemistry. And then followed up with professional experience as a cheesemaker and affineur in a farmhouse dairy and for a wholesaler based up in Scotland. For the past 5 years or so, I've been working as a technical advisor to businesses of all kinds of shape and size, some making cheese with raw milk, some pasteurized, some very small scale, some very large. I was one of the co-authors of the European Commission's Guide to Good Hygiene Practice in artisan cheesemaking. That was published by the European Commission in 2016. And I've been a trainer on HACCP courses aimed at food enforcement officers on behalf of the Food Standards Agency and Food Standards Scotland here in the UK. As technical director for the Academy of Cheese, I've been responsible for setting up a 4-level training program, principally aimed at cheese retail and wholesalers, but also picking up interested consumers, food service staff. This is a 4-level training program aimed at upskilling people involved in cheese retail and giving more information to the consumers and people who are at the sharp end of selling cheese to the customers in the restaurants. I'm also the author of Homemade Cheese, which is published by Lawrence Books, once again in 2000. So we've got a fair bit that we need to cover today. We have to accept that milk is an inherently variable food because of the way it's produced. We would expect there to be fluctuations in some of the physicochemical parameters of the milk, and of course that's going to have an impact on the cheese-making properties of the milk. The first slide that we have here looks at some variations in the level of fat, protein to fat ratio, and the urea content of the milk. The data here was taken over a period from May 2012 through to September 2013 from one single farm in the south of England, a farm with 180 Holstein Friesian cows. We see several lines on the graph in front of you. The first line that we'll look at is the blue line, and that is the fat level. We see below that, a little way below that, the protein is shown by the gold or yellow line. And in the middle of those two lines, we find the protein to fat ratio marked in red. We find on this farm that the protein level is fairly stable. We see more fluctuation in the fat levels, and it's that fat fluctuation which is principally driving the differences in the protein to fat ratio. Urea is maybe one parameter that many cheesemakers don't actually look at. But it can have a significant impact on the cheesemaking properties of the milk, as we'll see a little bit later on in the presentation. On this particular farm, we find that during the summer months, we find a peak in the urea level, and during the winter months, we see a trough in the urea level. We'll come back and talk more about urea later on. When we're looking at the cheese-making properties of milk, it's not just the total solids that we're interested in, the level of fat and protein, but it's also the ratio between the two. Various studies have looked at the effect of modifying protein to fat ratio on the cheese-making properties of milk. There was a very good study published in 2007 by a team from the Republic of Ireland. Here, the authors concluded that modifying the protein to fat ratio in the production of a cheddar style cheese within the parameters of 0.7 to 1.15, those are the protein to fat ratios they were looking at, modifying the protein to fat ratio didn't significantly affect the rate of curd firming, the total coagulation time. It didn't affect the speed of acidification, and it didn't affect the level of calcium and phosphorus retained within the cheese. There was a slight increase in calcium and phosphorus as the protein to fat ratio increased, but it wasn't a significant increase. However, protein to fat ratio does have a more significant impact upon other parameters when we're looking at cheese composition. So increases in the protein to fat ratio obviously would result in increased protein and decreased fat levels in the final cheese. But there were other parameters that were affected by this ratio as well. First of all, the moisture content. As we increase the protein to fat ratio, the amount of water that we actually recover from the milk and end up with in the cheese would decrease. And this is consistent with the hypothesis proposed by the authors that we would see greater senescence in the higher protein fat ratio cheeses. Senescence being the ability of the curd to contract and squeeze moisture out of itself. This is generally improved when we have higher protein and lower fat. There was also a significant effect on the actual yield of cheese. We found that the yield would decrease as the protein to fat ratio increased. Once again, we can attribute this largely to the senescence. If the protein to fat ratio is high, then we're going to be able to expel more water from the curds during cheese making. Our yields would therefore be lower. As the protein to fat ratio drops, we would tend to find more moisture retained within the cheese, so the actual yield would tend to increase. The protein to fat ratio would also have an effect on the fat and dry matter, which decreases as the protein to fat ratio increases. And it would have an effect on the moisture in non-fat substance, which would once again decrease as protein to fat ratio increases. The authors reported that the moisture in non-fat substance is likely to drop to levels likely to impair quality the moisture in non-fat substance is likely to increase to a level likely to impair quality when the protein to fat ratio dropped below 0.8. The authors also reported an effect on the aqueous salt, which decreased as the protein to fat ratio increased, and this was attributed by the authors to changes in the moisture level within the cheese that would affect the rate of salt uptake and retention. Overall, there was a conclusion that an optimum protein to fat ratio could be proposed that would balance the need for both quality and yield. If our protein to fat ratio drops, then we're going to improve the yields, but the quality of the cheese may drop. And conversely, if we increase the protein to fat ratio, then the quality may improve. However, that may come at the expense of some yield. With many things in cheese making, there's a sweet spot right in the middle that we need to hit perfectly in order to maximize all the particular parameters. In this case, quality and yield can be maximized if we establish an optimum protein to fat ratio. The authors of the study also reported effects on the whey composition. And here it's quite interesting because it tells us a little bit about the efficiency of the cheese making process. The weight of whey that was recovered in cheese making would increase as the protein to fat ratio increases. Once again, this is attributed to greater senescence. The loss of whey after salting would increase with low protein to fat ratio milk. And furthermore, losses of fat into the whey would tend to increase as the protein to fat ratio drops. So essentially, the lower the protein, the higher the fat, the more fat we're actually going to end up losing from the curd during salting or during cheese making. The level of curd fines, small curd particles lost in the whey, weren't significantly affected by the protein to fat ratio. However, the authors reported that there were slightly higher losses of protein seen after salting low protein to fat ratio cheese. Here we can see that a low protein to fat ratio will actually have an impact on the efficiency of the cheese making process. We will lose more solids into the whey as the protein to fat ratio drops. Other authors have also looked at the issue of protein and fat level, both in cheese and in whey. That here we see a study from 1992 in which the authors looked at the effect of increasing or decreasing the fat level by about 1%. We would see that as the fat level in the milk increased by 1%, the protein level in the cheese would decrease by 2.61%. The fat level in the cheese would increase by 4.22%. And the authors reported that more fat was lost in the whey. Conversely, a 1% increase in protein would increase the cheese protein by 2.35%. It would decrease the fat by 6.14%, and we would see less fat lost in the whey. Essentially, the two studies that we've discussed here are consistent in reporting that the cheese-making efficiency would be improved at higher rather than lower protein to fat ratios. And a study here from 2001 reported that 77% of the variability in the yield of fresh curd could be accounted for by the fat and protein level in the milk and the ratio between the two. And 87% of the variability in the dry matter yield in a pressed uncooked cheese could be attributed to this protein to fat ratio too. We see that the protein to fat ratio is therefore significantly able to affect the quantity and quality of the cheeses that we make. It is, of course, possible to standardize the protein to fat ratio using something called the Pearson square. And some of you may be familiar with this already. The Pearson square is essentially a way of taking two substances of known composition, in this case, the fat percentage, and mixing them together to achieve a mixture with a percentage somewhere between those two parameters. The way the Pearson square would work, we have a small box here. We have on one side of it, on the left side, the milk and the cream that we're looking to mix together. The milk being shown by letter A, cream fat percentage there is shown by letter B. Fat percentage for the mixture is shown by letter C. And then to use the Pearson square, we need to work diagonally across the square. First of all, we'll take the work out the proportion of milk that we need to calculate that. We would start in the bottom corner. We take the cream of known fat percentage B. We subtract C, the target percentage. That would give us the proportion of milk. And working the other way, we would subtract the target percentage from the percentage in the milk, and that would give us the proportion of cream. To give you a worked example here, if we have 100 litres of whole milk with a protein level of 3.4%, a fat level of 3.5%, and a protein to fat ratio of 0.97%, the cheesemaker here, let's say they want to reduce the protein to fat ratio down to 0.85. To do that, we have to add some fat. To calculate our target fat level, we would take the protein, we would divide it into the protein to fat ratio target. So in this case, 3.4 divided into 0.85, which would give us a fat level of 4%. We can then plug these values into the Pearson square. We have our milk fat of 3.5. We have some cream with a fat percentage of 48%. And we're trying to get the fat down to a level of 4 in order to balance that protein to fat ratio. Working diagonally across the square, first of all, we start out with 44% minus, 48% minus the 4% target. We know we need 44 parts of milk. And to work out the cream, we would subtract 3.5 from the 4% target, and that would give us 0.5 parts of cream. We would need 44 parts of milk for every 0.5 parts of cream, and that would standardize the protein to fat ratio. It's also possible to use the Pearson square to mix skimmed milk with full fat milk in order to reduce the protein to fat ratio. So this can be applied to increase or decrease that ratio as we wish. But we have to accept that there are some limitations here on the standardization of milk. While we can standardize fat and protein, it won't standardize other milk composition parameters. Various authors have looked at equations which can define cheese yield. One very famous equation would be the Van Slyke equation, which is used to predict yields in cheddar production. Here, the percentage yield is equal to the fat multiplied by 0.93 plus the casein level in the milk minus 0.1, which is a factor which accounts for casein losses and curd fines, the casein that's lost during coagulation. That's multiplied by a factor of 1.09, which accounts for other solids in the cheese, and that's divided into 1 minus the percentage moisture. This is a way of easily calculating the theoretical yield of cheddar. Where equations like this are used and we find that our actual yields are significantly different to the predicted yield, it's worth going back and looking at the protein to fat ratio and also the level of casein that we find in milk in relation to the total protein. Significant differences in the theoretical and actual yields can be attributed to issues with milk composition in this way. What we see here is that the yield is correlated significantly with the level of fat in the milk and the level of protein, but that any difference to the proportion of casein to total protein or any increase in the amount of solids that we were losing into the whey due to an inefficient cheesemaking process, they could have quite a significant impact on the final composition of the cheese and therefore the ratio of theoretical to actual yield. One of the parameters that is not going to be standardized by standardizing fat or protein in milk is the urea level, which I mentioned very briefly earlier on. Some cheesemakers may be using milk from many different farms blended together. Others might be using milk from a single farm or a small number of farms. As a general rule, the fewer the number of farms that we're working with, the more likely we're going to see, the more likely it is we're going to see significant impacts from varying urea levels throughout the course of the year, highly dependent on the feeds that are being used as well. A high urea level for cows would be something like 0.04%, a low level would be 0.01%. We find that the urea will have a significant impact on the acidification profile of the cheese. A high urea level will inhibit the starter cultures for a longer period of time, so we'll see a longer lag time before the pH starts to come down. And a low urea level will allow for less inhibition of the starter cultures, so they'll wake up and they'll begin to grow. We'll enter the exponential phase of the pH curve a little bit sooner. One thing is obvious from that: if we're making cheese at different points in the year, where the urea level is either high or low, and if we're making cheese according to the clock, according to a time-based pattern of cheese making, rather than looking at the acidification profile of the cheese and working with that, then we're going to end up with significant differences in the final cheese as a result of the faster or slower acidification that we're seeing. Urea is one of those parameters that actually has a pretty fundamental impact on the quality of the final cheese. Some farms are able to control the urea levels within very tight parameters. Others, as in the farm that we were looking at on the very first slides today, tend to have much greater fluctuation in the urea levels, and that fluctuation tends to be quite seasonal based on the feeds that are being used. Urea is one of those parameters that maybe cheesemakers need to pay more attention to, as it can have a significant bearing on the quality of the final cheese. Within the milk, we have a rich assortment of milk enzymes, and these can also have a bearing on the quality of cheese-making milks. One of the enzymes which is perhaps most significantly involved in the ripening, flavor development, and textural breakdown of the cheese is something called plasmin. This is essentially an enzyme which is present as a leakage product from the blood of the milking animal. The plasmin level would tend to be highest right at the start of the lactation, which we see in the graph at the top here. The line on the bottom shows that the plasmin level and milk yield are correlated. They start off high and they begin to drop as we reach late lactation. This was from a study in cow's milk. We also find in the graph at the bottom a study taken from ewe's milk. We find that the plasmin level would tend to decrease here throughout the lactation stage, but there's a strong impact which is made by the somatic cell count. The line at the top we see is a high somatic cell count milk. The line at the bottom is a low somatic cell count milk. Basically, the higher the cell count within the herd, the higher the plasmin level will be. This is an enzyme which is able to make it through pasteurization in an intact active form, and within the body of the cheese it will be involved in the ripening, the breakdown of the proteins or proteolysis during ripening, which will give us a lot of the flavor compounds, some of which we might want, some of which we may not, and which would affect the texture of the final cheese. Standardization of the milk won't significantly affect the level of plasmin which is present within the cheese-making milk and the impact it would have during the longer ripening period. So we would accept, perhaps, that there are limitations to standardizing milk for fat and protein. It's going to change one parameter in the milk, but it's certainly not going to change all of them. Here we'll look at some of the factors which affect protein concentration in the milk. The level of milk protein would typically decline in animals over 3 years. A figure of 0.4% and 0.4% decrease has been reported in cows over 5 lactations. So we would expect that the greater the lactation number, the lower the protein level is going to fall in the milk. One important factor here is that that decline is mainly observed in the casein fraction. So the significant difference to the total protein is actually a significant difference to the casein level rather than the level of whey protein. The casein number is an expression of the level of casein in relation to the total protein in the milk. We would typically find that the casein level was around about 80% of the total protein. But of course, if we're looking at animals which have had more lactations, that casein number will start to drop a little. And it's the casein that we're interested in when we're making cheese rather than the total protein. If casein is dropping in relation to total protein, our cheese-making yield will decrease, possibly significantly. One factor that has been reported in several studies which would affect the level of milk protein is that of heat stress. And here we're talking about temperatures greater than 29 degrees. I would imagine that these are temperatures that are fairly common for you in Australia. It's maybe a little bit less common in the UK, where it tends to be a little bit colder and wetter. Heat stress, elevated temperatures, possibly as a result of decreased feeding, are associated with significantly decreased levels of milk protein. Studies have also found that the feeding of vegetable fats and oils will depress the protein production in the milk. We'll find that there are significant differences in the composition of the caseins. We have different types of casein, alpha, beta, kappa casein. The relative concentrations of beta casein in this case would tend to increase with animal stress. One study has found that feed restrictions up to about 30% of the dry matter shouldn't significantly impact milk production, but that underfeeding energy will decrease the milk protein level slightly. Large increases in total protein have been associated with smaller increases in casein, which would mean that the casein number is lower. Therefore, from a farming point of view, our target shouldn't just be to increase the total protein. Really, our target should be to increase the casein level. This is perhaps a little bit trickier. It's relatively easy to increase total protein, but casein level will not tend to rise proportionally. Finally, high urea levels in the milk tend to be correlated with lower casein numbers. In some cases, a high urea level could be a beneficial thing, though it can also have an impact on the speed of acidification, which could impact the food safety profile, perhaps, of the cheese. But this urea level, there's a strong correlation with the casein level of the milk. Next, we'll look at the factors which affect the fat concentration in milk. First of all, the forage length. This would have an impact on milk composition. A study found that foragers chopped less than 1 centimetre would dramatically reduce the fat percentage in the milk and would tend to increase the protein. And the fats tend to increase where 15% of the forage is chopped to a length of 5 centimetres or more. Fibre and milk fat are positively correlated. As fibre is increased, milk fat will increase as well. And underfeeding energy will have very little effect on the milk fats. Feeding unprotected fats, rumen unprotected fats, will have variable effects on the milk fat level. The significant factor here to influence the fat percentage would be the chop length of the forage. Studies have looked at the effects of feeds as well. Cows fed grass silage tended to see increases in the milk yield, but the fat, protein, and casein level were all lower when compared to cows fed hay. Silage is typically associated with lower levels of kappa casein and beta casein, and higher levels of alpha S1 casein and alpha S2 casein. Grass silage diets have been associated with a more deep yellow colour in the finished cheeses than those produced from animals fed on a hay-based diet, and this has been reported by authors in several studies. There have also been significant effects on the aroma profile and texture of cheeses reported from animals fed grass silage versus hay. Typically, more alcohol and chemical aromas were reported in cheeses made with grass silage, and a less melting texture in the final cheese, a less supple or yielding texture. This has been proposed as being due to the increased levels of alpha S1 casein, and this is a subtype of casein which is largely responsible for the softening of the paste of a cheese. If we have more alpha S1 casein, we would require higher levels of proteolysis in order to break down this structure and give us the more supple texture in the final cheese. The acidification profile of the cheese in relation to the speed of drainage is one of the parameters that has an absolutely fundamental role in defining the quality and texture of the final cheese. The image that we see here, we see a graph, a pH curve, and two cheeses beside it, cheese A and cheese B. These were cheeses that I prepared for the Science of Artisan Cheese conference in Somerset several years ago. Essentially, two cheese makes that were exactly the same, save for one parameter, a slightly bigger cut size on cheese A than we saw on cheese B, and therefore better drainage on cheese B throughout cheese making. We see some critical differences in the appearance of the final cheese. Cheese B was much more elastic and rubbery. Cheese A was more chalky and crumbly. We see cheese A has significant signs of advanced proteolysis around the rind, some significant breakdown in parts being responsible for the lifting of the cheese rind. In cheese B, we see a much more smooth and even paste from one side of the cheese to the other. The speed of acidification in both of these makes was pretty much the same. However, there was a difference to the speed of drainage in both of the cheeses, obviously, as a result of the cut size. On the graph that we see beside the picture of the cheese, first of all, we see a little black time bar. And this black line shows the drainage period for one particular cheese. If that is happening between two known pH points, then we're going to achieve a certain quality and texture in the final cheese, which is due to the speed of acidification and its effect on demineralizing the curd, shedding calcium from the curds. The more the acidification takes place, the more calcium we're going to tend to shed from the curd. The faster the drainage before the acidification takes place, the more calcium we're going to tend to retain within the curd. And it's this demineralization of the curd which will have the fundamental impact on the quality of the final cheese. The black line shows one cheese drainage period in relation to the acidification. The blue line beneath that shows a cheese which drains for the same period of time, but where the acidity is further developed at the start of drainage. This cheese we would expect to be less elastic, perhaps less rubbery, perhaps more brittle. A cheese which has the same drainage period, but a much more advanced acidification, a more advanced pH, will tend to be more like cheese A than cheese B. And then on the bottom line, the green line, we see a drainage period which is extended. Here we have a cheese which is starting to drain off at the same time as the cheese shown by the black line, but where the drainage is prolonged, which means that at every point during the drainage, the pH is reaching much lower values by the time the drainage is complete, and therefore we're going to demineralize more calcium from the protein network within the curd, and we're going to end up with a cheese which is more like cheese A. Two ways of essentially making crumbly cheeses or cheeses with lifting rinds. We can either have a more advanced acidification, a more advanced pH, or we can have a much more slow, prolonged drainage. And we see on the picture here the effects that even quite small differences in speed of drainage can have on the quality of the final cheese. These two cheeses were made on the same day with milk from the same herd. But obviously, if we see differences in the protein to fat ratio, differences in the milk composition from one day's cheese making to the next, this type of variability we can find in the final cheeses that we're making on any day of the week. It's important to recognize that there are certain process parameters that we really must measure, monitor during cheese making in order to optimize the cheese making process. If we know that the speed of acidification and the speed of drainage have a significant effect on the quality and texture of the final cheese, then we know that we need enough pH monitoring to be able to clearly define what the pH curve looks like. This would typically be, should be easy to plot that out based on at least 5 reads throughout the cheese make. One right at the start, so we know what the start point is, one right at the end, at the point that we're salting the cheese, and maybe 3 throughout the steepest part of the pH curve. Hopefully one of those being quite close to the point in which the curve enters its steepest part. And that would typically be at a pH of around 6 to 6.3. 5 pH reads should be enough throughout the course of the make to define what the pH curve looks like. To explain a little bit about the reasons for the demineralization of the curd having an effect, a bearing on the quality of the final cheese. First of all, we need to look at this diagram, which shows us the rennet coagulation of the cheese. So starting in the top left-hand corner, we have some casein, a casein micelle, floating around freely in the milk. The casein organizes itself so that the alpha beta caseins tend to cluster towards the center. And around the outside, we have these little kappa casein tails. The rennet enzyme, the chymosin, will come in and it will cut the end off those kappa casein tails, destabilizing the structure of the casein. So it's no longer happy floating around freely in the water phase of the milk. It wants to find other caseins, and it wants to find some calcium phosphate, which is present in the milk, and it'll use the calcium phosphate to form a network, a gel network, with the calcium acting as a bridge between all of the casein. During the acidification of the curd, this calcium phosphate will be shed from the curd. The more calcium phosphate we lose, the more we're losing connections between the casein, we're losing the ability of the curd to contract and to undergo syneresis. So greater acidification, faster acidification in relation to the drainage, or slower drainage in relation to the acidification, will cause more demineralization of the curd and impaired syneresis, greater retention of moisture within the final cheese. And this is consistent with the effects that were reported in the first study that we talked about, where low protein to fat ratios, lower syneresis, impaired the quality of the final cheese. So turning our attention back to the coagulation of the curd for a moment, this gel that starts to form will form once the caseins have been cut down and they've started to aggregate using calcium phosphate. The first point that we would see the gel beginning to form as cheesemakers, we would sometimes describe this as the flocculation point, the point at which milk is no longer completely liquid, it's starting to become a weak solid. And we would see this when around about 80 or 90% of the casein has been cut down. This is the point at which we would see noticeable flocculation, which can be detected by the cheesemaker either through gently brushing your finger across the surface of the milk and looking for changes in the viscosity and surface tension. Some cheesemakers will put a little plastic dish on the surface of the milk and spin it around. If the dish spins, then we've not achieved the flocculation point yet. If the If there's resistance to the spinning of the disc, then we've achieved flocculation. Other cheesemakers might put a drop of the rennet of milk into a measuring cylinder full of some warm water. The flocculation point can be seen when, rather than dispersing and making the water cloudy, the drop of milk turns into little flakes of curd that would sink down towards the bottom and then eventually start to rise back up again. The various ways in which people can assess when the flocculation is visibly observed in the cheesemaking milk, but this would typically happen when about 80 or 90% of the casein has been cut down and starts to aggregate into a gel. And there are various factors that would influence this speed of coagulation. First of all, the temperature. The aggregation of the casein won't happen at temperatures below 18 degrees, and it'll happen faster and faster as the temperature approaches 40 degrees. If we have a cheese recipe where we're aiming to rennet the milk at 32 degrees, and one day we achieve a temperature of 32.5 degrees, that can have a significant bearing on the speed of coagulation. The pH level of the milk will impact coagulation speed. As the pH falls, the set will happen much more quickly. That's quite a significant effect between the pH values of 6.6 and 6.4. As the pH comes down towards 6.4, the coagulation happens incredibly quickly, and then the effect of pH tails off a little bit thereafter. Obviously, if we have milk coming in normally at 6.6, but one day it comes in at 6.55, that's going to have a significant bearing on the speed of coagulation. Pasteurization temperature, increased time temperature combinations will tend to prolong coagulation time, which is caused by denaturation of the whey proteins. If the pasteurizer goes into divert multiple times during pasteurization, this can slow down the speed of coagulation through the associated denaturation of the whey protein. The level of calcium will tend to impact the aggregation of the caseins. The aggregation will happen much faster when the calcium level is increased. And finally, the level of protein. As the protein concentration tends to increase, the aggregation of the casein will tend to happen much faster. This is one of the reasons why we find that sheep's milk sets incredibly quickly. It has a very high level of protein. So we have various parameters here that are going to impact the speed of coagulation. And there's not one of those that we can really impact through modifying the protein to fat ratio. So here we really do see the effects or the limitations perhaps of standardizing the milk for fat and protein when there are so many other parameters that will affect cheese making properties. And this speed of coagulation is going to have a significant effect on the quality, texture of the final cheese. Here we have three bars which reflect periods of time. The first time bar at the top shows a 60-minute period. This is the renneting of the milk. We put in the rennet at the 0 point, we cut the curd at 60 minutes. In this case, flocculation is happening after about 20 minutes, which means that the cheesemaker is hardening their curd for a period of 40 minutes. 20 minutes to see the first signs of the set taking place. Everything that happens after the flocculation point is marked by a progressive cross-linking, more and more connections forming between the caseins, which will make the gel firmer, harder, and crucially will trap in more moisture into that gel. The longer the hardening time, the more moisture we're going to end up with in the curd. The more moisture is going to be held within the curd during cheese making, and therefore the slower the drainage. So this first cheesemaker has a 20-minute flocculation time. They cut the curd at 1 hour. They have a hardening time which is equal to 2 times the flocculation. Let's say for a moment that this cheesemaker is making cheese pretty much according to the clock. The rennet goes in and they set the curd and they cut it at a period which is defined by time. Here, and on another day's cheesemake, we have perhaps a 15-minute flocculation time. In this case, if the cheesemaker is still cutting on the hour, they would have a hardening time multiplication factor of 3 times flocculation. The cheesemaker on this second day's cheesemake will trap a lot more moisture into the curd than they did on the first day's cheesemake. And that can impact the quality of the texture of the final cheese. As we saw in the cases of cheese A and cheese B, the speed of drainage is a parameter that will impact final cheese quality. The way that the cheesemaker could correct for this is to stick to a standard hardening time multiplication factor. If the cheesemaker has worked out that 2 times flocculation is a hardening time multiplication factor that tends to give good cheese, they should stick to that ratio rather than leaving the curd for 45 minutes to harden. Here in the third time bar, they would only leave it for 30 minutes, 2 times flocculation, and they would be cutting the curd on the 45-minute mark. In dairies where we've introduced this focus on the speed of coagulation and the ratio of hardening time to flocculation time, where we've introduced these steps, we've been able to reduce significant sources of variability in the cheeses. And this has been applied to large-scale cheesemakers producing one type of hard cheese. It's also been applied to smaller dairies or large dairies who are making soft cheese in multiple vats. We've had successes in focus on flocculation and coagulation speed in dairies of all kinds of shape and size. It's been able to reduce many of the sources of variability that cannot be accounted for by standardizing the cheese milk. The pasteurization, the temperature, the pH value of the milk, all of these parameters will be addressed by this modification to the cut time. Now, we can summarize a few takeaway points here. We would accept that milk is a raw material with inherent variability. We would accept that there is an optimum protein to fat ratio, which will improve yield and the quality of the cheese. And that ratio is likely to be in the region of about 0.85 to 0.9 for many cheese recipes. Here we'll see maximized yield and quality together. Standardizing the protein to fat ratio cannot account for other sources of variability, such as the milk urea level, which can have an impact on the speed of acidification, or the pH value, which can have an impact on the speed of coagulation, and therefore the hardening and moisture retention of the curd. So we have to accept that milk standardization is a fairly limited way of reducing sources of variability. There are many other sources there. The speed of acidification and rennet coagulation should therefore be monitored and ideally controlled in order to optimize product quality. The relationship between the speed of acidification and the drainage of the curd, that's probably one of the greatest ways that we can impact variability and consistency in the final product. The drainage of whey from the curd must suit the speed of acidification. If the acidification is running very fast, then we need to speed up the drainage. And if the acidification is running slow, then we need to slow down the drainage. The same would be true if we have impaired drainage. If we know that the drainage is going to be slow, then we would need to slow down the speed of acidification. The two must always be balanced with one another. And there are various factors that we can use to impact this. There are ways of speeding up or slowing down drainage. If we know that our fat level is very high in the milk and the drainage is therefore likely to be slow, then we can improve the drainage of the milk by cutting the curd a little bit finer, stirring the curd a little bit more, or modifying the hardening time multiplication factor. If we know that drainage will be slow, then going for a lower hardening time multiplication factor could be one of the ways that we would allow the curd to give up its moisture a little bit more freely. The longer the hardening time, the more moisture will trap in the curd. Where milk isn't standardized, and not all small-scale cheesemakers will be standardizing their milk, we can sometimes find poor drainage due to higher fat. We can compensate for this through improving the drainage of the curd during cheesemaking. There are cheesemaking parameters that we can influence that will control the consistency, control the variability of the final cheese. We shouldn't just look at standardization of the milk composition. We shouldn't just look at an optimum protein to fat ratio as a way of reducing variability in the cheese. We also have to accept that the cheesemaker themselves has some fundamental controls to influence the speed of moisture loss from the curd. Where we know that the protein to fat ratio is low and therefore the drainage is likely to be impaired, improvements to the drainage of the curd during cheesemaking can help to reverse that difference. So we should finally accept that there are different strands to reducing variability and overcoming seasonal variations. First of all, we have the farming and milk production strand. The effect of feed and farming practice on milk composition will have a bearing on the final cheesemaking properties. We should limit that variability as much as is possible. Secondly, we would accept that standardization can help to set an optimal protein to fat ratio that will maximize both yield and quality. If it is possible or appropriate to standardize the milk, then we can do so. But we need to accept the limitations of that standardization. And finally, perhaps one of the most fundamental ways that we can impact quality, where we have direct control over final cheese quality, and that's through cheesemaking practice. Speeding up or slowing down the drainage can actually help to overcome many of the sources of variability that we find in the incoming milk supply. So thank you for your time and attention. I hope you found this an interesting presentation, and I'm happy now to take any questions. I see that we've had a few.
Can I just interrupt there? I was really interested to know if the people listening consider urea in their cheese making. There's a little tick or cross there, yes or no, in the chat box that you can, or might be, anyway, if you can just let me know. Maybe you, Kim, be interesting to know as you as a small cheese maker, Rianne. Yeah, but anyway, we'll go ahead while people are doing that. Kim Masters has got his first question there, please.
Okay, unprotected fats. So here, there's a question from Kim. What are the unprotected fats you mentioned in the factors affecting milk fat production? These are fats which are, certain feeds are able to withstand are protected from the effects of the rumen. Unprotected fats would be active within the rumen. Essentially, this is a type of feed which can be, which the herd nutritionist can give to an animal. This would have an impact on the final fat level in the milk. But it's also possible to get rumen protected fats which are not active within the rumen. This is more a herd nutrition issue than a cheese making or dairy technology issue. Next question. Do the studies show that all types of silage, millet, maize versus grass, have the same impact? This is a very interesting question. I don't think that I've seen any studies that have directly looked at the various types of silage. I think it's all been largely focused on grass silage, or at least the studies that I've seen have been largely focused on grass silage. I do know from first-hand experience, though, that the silage type can have a significant impact on the quality of the final cheese. As a professional cheesemaker myself, working on a farm that was very heavily dependent on maize silage, we found that there were significant drops in the urea level when the maize silage was being fed significantly through the winter months. And we would find that there were much faster speeds of acidification and much slower drainage as well in the curd due to quite a high fat level during the winter. So very fast acidification, very slow drainage. It tended to make for cheeses which had quite a pale texture in the case of maize silage, whereas at least one of the studies has reported a much deeper colour in farms that have used grass silage. I think, as I say, I'm not sure that I've seen any studies which compare like with like. I think that would probably be quite an interesting study, though. And I certainly know from first-hand experience that there can be a significant impact there. Another question here. Do you know what the effects of drought conditions are on the cheese-making process? Well, yes, there's some. And this is something we saw across several European countries last year, perhaps not to the same kind of extent that you might experience drought in Australia, admittedly. But a number of cheesemakers reported significant problems with coagulation during the summer. When the protein level had fallen and the total solids had fallen, there were issues with the yield. We also found that the protein that was there, it appeared that the casein number had dropped in at least some cases. So the proportion of casein to total protein had fallen. And this affected, of course, speed of coagulation, the moisture retaining properties of the curd through the speed of hardening. A number of cheesemakers had problems this summer due to drought, which of course will affect the feeding of the milking animal. It'll affect the protein levels. Yeah, here we would see quite significant effects. Generally, we would find that yields would decrease and speed of coagulation would perhaps slow down in some cases. Here, I think it would be quite easy, though, if we're focused on the milk production parameters, on the fat level, protein level, urea level, if that data is available to us. Perhaps a somatic cell count as well. If we're focused on that data and looking at trends, then it should be possible to start ironing out some of the possible variability issues that we're seeing. Although, of course, we can never completely overcome the effects of drought just through modifying cheese-making parameters. We can minimize it where possible, though. So another question, some parts of the year we're having foaming issues in cheese coming off the set tank after 12 hours of setting. We had to degas them before separation stage. Is seasonal variation impacting this? Sorry, are we talking about the foaming in the milk fat here? Is it possible to ask that question?
Jihan, can you talk, please? I've unmuted you. Hello? No, some people, that's why we don't have people talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if this is relating to the production of foam from the milk fats, there are certainly seasonal effects, or lactation stage effects as well, on both foam stability and foamability of the milk. So its likelihood to form a foam and the stability of that foam once it's formed.
Well, there we are.
Okay. So
Jihan, are you referring to cream cheese?
okay.
Okay.
And yeah, so the
Cream cheese, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so here really we're looking at issues relating to the foamability and foam stability of the milk fats. We can find at various points in time that the milk is more likely to foam than at others. I don't think there have been. I'm not sure that I've seen any significant studies from a cheese-making point of view that have looked at foam stability or foamability, but I certainly know, once again from first-hand experience, that there is a significant relationship between the average lactation stage and the ability of the foam to hang around. Do you know if there were a lot of early lactation animals that had just come in at the point that the milk was foaming significantly?
It'd be really good if we could talk here. Look, I might put you in touch. I just thought, Steve, I was just thinking, if you make cream cheese as well, you might have seen the same thing happen, and maybe you could talk.
Yeah, and here essentially, because we're dealing with a fluid, a mixture which is high in fat percentage, the impacts of lactation stage, yeah, they can be significant on foamability and foam stability. And because it's a high fat percentage mixture, of course, that is going to manifest a lot more than it would do in your standard cheese making vat with a lower fat percentage. But I'm certainly happy to continue this discussion.
Yeah. Okay, I'll put you in touch with each other then.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, folks, if you have any questions over the coming 1 week, you can let me know and I'll shoot them off to Paul and put you in touch. So thank you very much, Paul, for all your effort in today, and yeah, just fantastic. So big clap of the hands here, and really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.